when we talk about Europe and the United States, we see massive disparities emerging. We have 700,000 homeless people in the United States, and we have the world's first trillionaire.
Present, Western claims today about the moral superiority of the West invoke democracy, individual liberty, human rights, rule of law, protection of private property rights, essentially. And they use these claims to establish a right to intervene in other countries, a right to impose regime change, a right even to go to war. So, basically these claims involve a deliberate conflation of what Xi Jinping called the shared values of humanity: peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, freedom, with private property, capitalist institutions. And in doing so, what they're doing is advancing Western interests. And what they're also doing is they're equating modernization with westernization. And it's quite clear that modernization, especially now, does not imply westernization.
大家好，你们认为一个国家真正的强大究竟来自什么？是拥有全球霸权，还是能够不断提升人民生活，推动社会发展？今天这期视频带来的是一场围绕中国崛起、西方转型以及未来世界秩序变化展开的深度访谈。英国学者迈克尔·邓福德教授从全球经济、发展模式和国际格局等角度提出了一个颇具争议的问题：西方主导世界数百年的时代真的正在结束吗？过去，西方凭借工业革命、殖民扩张和金融体系建立了全球优势，美国更是在二战后成为世界霸主。但如今，曾经引领世界发展的西方国家却面临制造业衰退、贫富差距扩大以及社会矛盾加剧等问题。与此同时，中国却走出了一条不同的发展道路，从曾经贫困落后的国家到如今成为全球制造业中心和科技竞争的重要力量。中国在高铁、新能源、人工智能等领域快速发展，正在改变全球竞争格局。这也引发了一个争议：一个国家的成功到底应该如何衡量？是看它能否维持霸权，还是看它能否改善普通人的生活？如今，中国正在推动更加多极化的世界格局，而美国则试图维持过去几十年的全球主导地位。未来的世界究竟会继续由单一强国定义，还是会进入一个没有霸权、多方竞争的新时代？接下来，让我们一起走进这场讨论。
As far as these turning points are concerned, I argue, in a sense, the arguments are also presented by many other people. I argue that the world is at a turning point in three respects. The first is Xi Jinping's changes unseen in a century. Now, what I think he is noting is change to a multipolar world without a hegemonic power, and hopefully, therefore, the end of imperialism and colonialism. What Xi does not say is what he was thinking about, that occurred 100 years ago. So you can only surmise. I mean, I sometimes think, was he talking about the Soviet and Chinese revolutions? Maybe, maybe not. Was he simply thinking about the ascendance of the United States, to leadership of the Western world? But that's the first point. We're certainly at a turning point, and I shall come back to that particular point in a moment. Second, it's the end of an era that started 250 years ago with the British and the European Industrial Revolution. The British Revolution occurred in about 10 regions. It saw then an extraordinary increase in global inequality, and it saw the center of economic gravity of the world move from Asia to the North Atlantic. And my argument would be that era is ending, because in a sense, China is emerging as one of the most vital centers of manufacturing and industry in the world, and the center of economic gravity of the world is returning to Asia. Third, I argue that it is an end of an era that started in 1492, when Europeans used Song dynasty inventions to put guns on ships, although they did develop their own gun technology and, of course, modified the types of ships that they used, and basically proceeded to colonize the world. That, in a sense, was the beginning of an era of European domination of the world. So I think that era is coming to an end. The third thing, I think it's important to understand why the West started to decline and when it started to decline. And I tend to emphasize that it started really with the crisis in the 1970s, the end of a golden age. And in the book, I talk a lot about that golden age. Since then, basically the average rate of productivity growth in the G7 countries has progressively declined. Basically, productivity declined due to a decline in productive investment. And the decline in productive investment occurred because of a decline in the rate of profit on productive investment. So you could say that at that time, a kind of productive model of development, which existed, in Europe and indeed the United States, up until the 1970s, gave way to a model that was more concerned with the extraction of value and a financial model of accumulation. And of course, a lot of productive activities were moved offshore. But, critically at that point, the United States in 1971 took the dollar off gold. And that, in a sense, opened a wave of finance-led development. The rise of market finance, increased reliance on financial assets, even in the case of non-financial corporations, emphasis upon the extraction of value from privatized assets rather than the creation of value. This is something that Matsukoto emphasizes in a new report that she's just published with her colleagues. So basically, as productive investment declined, competitiveness declined. And eventually, as industrial economies, they were overtaken by China and by other emerging economies. And then they started to run quite early on in the case of Britain, very large trade deficits, budget deficits. So in a sense, what they were doing, they were spending more than they earned. Now, if the consequence, to put it in a few words, of these deficits for the US was that its net international investment position exploded from minus $84.6 billion in 1990 to minus $24.7 trillion in 2024. So the United States position came increasingly to depend on a surplus on its financial account, which reflects its ability to print its own currency, which is the same also to some extent for European countries. So dollar seigniorage, the role of the petrodollar, a dollar-based international system, the sale of treasury bills, and it also relies on foreign investment in the United States. And then it secondly relies on what is called primary income. So this means interest, commission, rent, profit, dividends, interest on loans that are denominated in dollars. And they derive, to a significant extent from the kind of control, it exercises over the rules of the international system. So what I then would in a sense argue is that it was in that context, that these emerging parts of the world themselves, because the institutions were controlled by the Western world, started to establish parallel institutions of global governance, parallel systems of payments. But on the other hand, the situation that we're in at the moment is that in a sense, the Western elites seem determined, in a sense, to maintain their leadership in the world. It's reflected in a succession of wars, and you could interpret, what happened in Venezuela and even what happened in Iran as an attempt to seize control of world energy resources. But also, we're in a situation where the United States, is seeking to solve its problems at the expense of its allies. But maybe we should come back to that when we talk about the international context, the context of the Western world in the international order.
Well, actually, I'm really interested. You're the one who introduced me years ago to the idea of the Gini index and of disparity. And we're talking about, where Western powers, the elite, are actually seeking rent. When we talk about Europe and the United States, we see massive disparities emerging. We have 700,000 homeless people in the United States, and we have the world's first trillionaire. Do you think there are specific lessons for Western economies that are coming out of the fact that there is so much disparity in the West at this time?
Maybe I think it's very important to emphasize the change that has occurred in the West. I mean, there was an extraordinary contrast, between what happened from 1945 until the 1970s and what happened afterwards. I mean, in that first era, the European economies, they grew at, even Great Britain, actually, which grew more slowly, grew at unprecedentedly fast speeds, but the fastest they'd ever grown. Basically, in that era, regional social inequalities diminished. Even if you look at the US, the rich got richer, but the poor got rich faster the lower their income was. So it was as if everyone was on a kind of upward moving escalator because living standards were improving. And it was an upward moving escalator, in which the gap between the top and the bottom was getting smaller. So it's very, very important to remember that era. But that was an era of managed capitalism, of Christian democratic, social democratic capitalism, with all the reforms, that were introduced especially after the Second World War. But once you move into this neoliberal era, you see a sharp slowdown in productivity and economic growth. And as I said, competitiveness fell. It fell very, very rapidly in Great Britain. And then, as that happened, you saw this increasing role of finance, and and it was in that context, in a sense, that these inequalities progressively exploded. So, I think, I think that past is something that people often, look back to and wonder whether it's ever possible to go back to that world, but, I think, in a sense, I say at various points, I think the problem is, that, I come back to this question, the fact that they spend more than they earn. I think, the fundamental problem is that there are these global elites, and that these global elites really seek, still to control the resources of the rest of the world, to in a sense resolve these problems of the Western world. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the growth in inequality itself is extremely, counterproductive. In the book, I deal with Italy quite a lot. I deal with the United Kingdom. I deal with other European countries. But in Great Britain, Great Britain is an economy with 22.7% of its gross value added is produced in London. 20.1% of that is produced by the financial sector. Household debt stands at 180% of GDP. Not just a matter of low income. All right. Money is basically invested in housing and stocks, and it drives up asset prices, and then that raises the cost structure and undermines the competitiveness. The fact that they allowed deindustrialization to occur, obviously, it was profitable for these companies that allowed deindustrialization to occur, but, workers were laid off, skills were not reproduced, education was transformed with much, much less emphasis upon engineering, skills, STEM subjects, and so on. Infrastructure was, in a sense, value was extracted, from infrastructure without renewing infrastructure. So, in a way, they created a situation in which you got, very, very serious social problems. You gave that figure for the United States. If you look at the UK, 30% of children live in households who are in poverty, and many of those households work. And if you look at certain regions in the UK, it's 38.3% of children in the northwest of England. It's 40.6% of children in the West Midlands. And then you've got these extraordinary social and cultural. So that's important.
I guess we're going to have to finish with geopolitics again. I want to talk about BRICS. We have, the BRICS, and it's BRICS Plus now, I guess. Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Yeah. We have the China's Global Civilization Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, Community of Shared Destiny initiatives. There's multiple of those. How do these represent visions of an alternative to the Western liberal universalism that has come from, Western philosophy basically being used as a sort of source of imperialism. How is this, and what should people be on the lookout when they think about multipolarity and whether it's emerging?
Okay. I mean, I think you've just asked an extremely important question. Maybe, I want to start, with something more philosophical. Aristotle advanced a theory of natural slavery. It's based on a substance ontology. And he argued that on their own, non-Greeks are incapable of reason, and that their purpose, telos, is to be subjugated by a rational Greek so that they act reasonably. Now, if you look at Chinese metaphysics, no group is ontologically superior to any other group. That's a source, of the sort of supremacist ideologies, that exist in the West. There's others, Hegel said progress starts in the East, ends in the West. The West is the end of history. So if you then look at what happened, basically at first, colonial conquest rests on claims of religious and racial superiority. But after the Enlightenment, colonialism and imperialism were actually advocated by leading liberal theorists. So de Tocqueville and Mill. So Mill, in relation to China, Mill said, if they are ever to be farther improved, it must be by foreigners. It's astonishing, huh? So, what was put in place, I say it was a liberal order. Its central aim was the guarantee of individual freedom and private property rights, a visible hand of law that protects them, private property rights and liberty, from the state and the demos, and the people, if you wish, alongside the hidden hand of the market. And it's an order that basically sanctions and reproduces profound inequalities. Now, if you look at present, Western claims today about the moral superiority of the West invoke democracy, individual liberty, human rights, the rule of law, protection of private property rights, essentially. And they use these claims to establish a right to intervene in other countries, a right to impose regime change, a right even to go to war. So, basically, these claims involve a deliberate conflation of what Xi Jinping called the shared values of humanity: peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, freedom, with private property, capitalist institutions. And in doing so, what they're doing is advancing Western interests. And what they're also doing is they're equating modernization with westernization. And it's quite clear that modernization, especially now, does not imply westernization. And indeed, many parts of the world are embarking on new paths that reflect their civilizational characteristics. Now, at certain points in the book, I compare Western and Chinese thought. The starting point in Chinese thought is not ontological individualism. It's the cornerstone of liberalism. In Chinese thought, the starting point is the existence of the self in relation to others and a concept of harmony, which therefore denies the view of Hobbes, that man is a wolf to man, and that human beings are incapable of coming to any agreement on the common good. So you just have to live and let live. That's one, Aristotle also claimed that all physical objects are a combination of matter and form. And that leads to the possibility of the imposition of form on matter. So if the Western civilization imposes what it considers a suitable form on matter, which is communities in other parts of the world. It's very curious, the way this sort of underlying philosophy shapes or legitimizes conduct. Now, if you look at Chinese ontology, it's empirical, which is very striking, so is Chinese practice. And in Chinese thought, there is nothing that does not have a form. So in Chinese ontology, all things, Wanwu, they say, are considered to be in a state, everything is in a state of change as a result of its own inner potentialities. So, and then their interaction with everything else. And it's basically underpinned by an account of causal efficacy that rests upon non-coercive actions that accommodate and enable everything, Wanwu, to realize its potentialities. So this is a profoundly different way of looking at the world. And, as I would argue, if you listen to some of the speeches Xi Jinping makes, in many ways it's informed by this kind of world vision. So, the core concept in China is harmony. So Chinese and East Asian visions are basically of a harmonious society, an international order in which you seek to avoid conflict, basically through the pursuit of shared interests, mutual respect for different civilizations and their values, and non-interference. And, they're rooted in, these Chinese concepts, all under heaven, tianxia, guanxi, relationality, symbiosis, gongsheng. And as I've said, all of them emphasize the existence of the self in relation to others rather than the existence of the self in isolation, which is a characteristic of liberal thought. So, I'm saying that, in a sense, liberal thought legitimizes many things that are really deeply contestable. And it's quite interesting to go to Chinese thought. And I'm sure it exists in other civilizations to find sort of an alternative foundation for looking at the world. And, you said, the book discusses BRICS Shanghai. You can see much of that growing out of what I've just said. In a sense, it provides some of the philosophical underpinnings, some of the value underpinnings, of this alternative vision of the world.
看完这场讨论，或许我们真正需要思考的，并不是简单判断谁会赢，谁会输，而是一个更深层的问题：一个国家的发展道路究竟应该用什么标准来衡量？过去几个世纪，西方国家凭借工业革命、科技创新以及全球贸易体系，建立了长期的优势。但历史从来不是一成不变的。当一个国家的经济模式、产业结构以及社会发展出现变化时，全球力量格局也会随之改变。迈克尔·邓福德教授在访谈中提出，今天世界正在经历一次重要转折。一方面，西方国家依然拥有强大的科技、金融和军事实力，但与此同时，制造业空心化、财富分配不均以及社会矛盾等问题也正在成为越来越无法回避的挑战。另一方面，中国的发展轨迹也正在改变世界对现代化道路的理解，从过去依靠低成本制造，到如今在新能源、人工智能、高端制造等领域展开竞争。中国正在尝试从世界工厂走向创新型经济体，而这一变化也让全球开始重新思考，现代化是否只有一种模式？当然，关于中国道路、西方制度以及未来国际秩序的讨论，至今仍然存在巨大争议。有人认为，中国的发展证明了不同于西方的发展模式同样可以取得成功。也有人认为，全球竞争的未来仍然取决于创新能力、制度调整能力以及解决内部问题的能力。但无论最终答案是什么，一个事实正在逐渐清晰，世界正在发生变化。过去由单一力量主导的国际格局正在向更加复杂、多元的方向发展。未来的世界不仅取决于哪个国家拥有更强大的实力，也取决于哪个国家能够创造更有效的发展方式，回应普通民众对于更好生活的期待。那么，在你看来，中国的崛起是否意味着全球秩序正在改变？西方模式是否正在面临新的挑战？未来的世界会走向竞争对抗，还是多极共存？欢迎在评论区留下你的看法。